Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Yeah, welcome everyone.
Listen, before we drop into the rabbit hole today,
Yeah.
and I promise you this is a really deep one, do me a solid. Hit that like button right now, smash subscribe, and ring the bell.
Definitely do that.
It really helps the algorithm find us, and it helps us keep bringing you this kind of high-octane analysis. You don't want to miss what we have coming down the pipe.
For sure. And today is frankly a bit different for us. Usually we're dissecting a business trend or maybe unpacking a historical event. But today we're looking at something that presents itself as a book, but the author, Conrad Reicher, explicitly calls it a weapon.
A weapon for the mind.
Right.
We are diving into a text called Knowledge Acquisition, Continuous Strategic Reflective Learning, and Integral Theory by Conrad Reicher.
It's a mouthful.
It is, but don't let that academic title fool you. This isn't some textbook for a liberal arts class.
Not at all.
This is a field manual. Reicher wrote this specifically for the red-pilled manosphere. You know men who look at the modern world and see what Reicher calls a cacophony of emotive drivel.
Yeah, it's really framed as a survival guide for what he terms the intellectual sovereign. Reicher's core thesis is that Western civilization hasn't just naturally evolved or changed. He says it has been captured.
Captured, right.
He argues that our institutions, the universities, the media, the legal system, have all been infected by a specific ideological virus, one that prioritizes feelings over objective facts. And he's not just complaining about it on the internet, he's trying to literally hand the reader the tools to dismantle it.
Right. And before we get too deep here, we have to make something crystal clear to you, the listener. We are reporting on his battle plan. We are unpacking Reicher's worldview, his history of the decline, and the tactical logic he says you need to survive.
Exactly. We're just analyzing his arguments.
Right. We aren't taking sides here. Whether you lean left or right, our mission today is just to impartially break down the theories and the perspective presented in the text.
Just looking at the blueprint he drew up.
Exactly. And frankly, if you want the full schematics on how to reclaim what he calls the logic of kings, you need to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books and buy the book right now. This deep dive is the map, but the book is the actual territory.
So let's start with the foundation. Right off the bat, Reicher described our current cultural moment as the sunder of the logos.
The sunder of the logos. It sounds almost biblical.
It does, and it is in a way. The logos is the Greek concept for the divine order or the rational structure of the universe. It's that fundamental connection between a word and the reality it describes.
Right.
And Reicher argues that modern society, driven by what he calls a mob of screeching APCs, has completely severed that connection. We are living in a time where he says feelings have actively replaced objective truth.
So this is basically the whole my truth versus the truth debate.
Precisely. Reicher says that when you allow language to just drift, like when a word can mean one thing today and the exact opposite tomorrow just because someone feels emotional about it, you aren't just being polite or inclusive.
You're destroying the infrastructure.
Exactly. You are destroying the infrastructure of civilization. If words don't anchor to a shared reality, you can't have a law, you can't have science, and you certainly can't have justice.
So his solution isn't to just go out and outshout the mob, it's to outthink them, using what he calls apex reason.
Right, he wants a total return to Aristotelian logic, the logic of kings. And the most basic rule there is the law of non-contradiction. Simply put, A is A. A thing is itself. It cannot be itself and its opposite at the exact same time.
It seems so incredibly basic. A is A. But Reicher argues that the modern progressive worldview is actually built on violating this fundamental law.
He does. He argues that to survive in the modern left-wing landscape, you essentially have to hold contradictory thoughts simultaneously.
Like a cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. He says you have to believe that gender is entirely a social construct, but also believe that being transgender is an innate biological reality.
Yeah.
Or you have to believe race doesn't exist biologically, but also that absolutely everything must be viewed through a racial lens.
No.
Reicher calls this a logical suicide. He wants the reader to train their mind to become an impenetrable fortress, where A is always A, regardless of whose feelings get hurt.
And he illustrates this kind of radical focus with a pretty killer historical example. Isaac Newton in the year 1666.
Oh, the Annus Mirabilis. Yeah, the Year of Wonders. So the plague is tearing through London.
Yeah.
People are completely terrified, dying in the streets, screaming for salvation. It was absolute chaos everywhere.
Absolute panic.
And what does Newton do? He doesn't join the protests. He doesn't start a charity or panic with the crowd. He goes to Woolsthorpe Manor and practices radical social distancing.
He literally just shuts the door on the world.
He completely shut out the emotional noise of the collective. And in that extreme silence, he invented calculus and formulated the theory of gravity. Riker's main point here is that genius, what he calls true apex reason, is utterly incompatible with the herd.
The herd brings you down.
Right. The collective is a toxin, according to him. It demands consensus, not truth. He jokes that if Newton had been on Twitter checking the current thing, we wouldn't even have physics.
That silence is the key to his method. But Riker takes it a step further than just, having good focus. He connects this capacity for independent thought to the theological concept of imago Dei.
The image of God. Now, Riker isn't preaching a sermon here, to be clear. He's making a really specific ontological claim about the masculine mind.
Okay, unpack that.
He argues that being made in the imago Dei means you have a direct, hardwired line to objective reality. You are literally wired to apprehend the logos.
Which means you don't need the group or the tribe to tell you what's real.
That is the crucial unlock in his theory. If your validation comes from your ability to perceive objective truth, the divine order, then you are entirely immune to gaslighting. Riker calls this the ultimate shield against gynocentric silence.
Right, so when the culture says you can't say that it's offensive.
The sovereign individual just says, I don't care if it's offensive. Is it true?
But this isn't just an abstract philosophy class. Riker grounds this heavily in biology. This is where he brings in what he calls the biohistorical imperative.
He is totally unrelenting on this point. Biology is a commandment. It's not a suggestion. You can try to legislate against gravity, but you'll still splatter if you jump off a cliff.
Right.
Riker argues that modern society is currently trying to legislate against millions of years of sexual dimorphism.
And he goes straight at the throat of the modern testosterone myth. I mean, we are constantly told that testosterone is a source of war and toxicity and chaos.
And Riker pulls up the receipts to counter that. He cites a major study, the 2010 Eisenegger study in the journal Nature. This is a huge piece of his argument.
Yeah, that study was fascinating.
It really was. The study actually showed that testosterone does not cause mindless rage. It actually promotes calm, calculated dominance and strategic fairness.
Strategic fairness.
Yeah.
It really makes sense if you think about how a military platoon operates or even a high-level boardroom. The most dominant guys in those rooms aren't the ones screaming and flipping tables.
No, not at all.
They're the ones who are cool, collected, and enforcing the rules of the group.
Exactly. Riker calls testosterone the biological fuel of high-performance masculinity. It drives men to seek order, to protect their in-group, and to build hierarchies that are based purely on competence.
So the framing is totally backwards.
He argues that when the modern world demonizes testosterone, they aren't actually trying to stop violence. They're trying to stop the chemical engine of civilization itself. They essentially want to sedate the builders.
And because nature filters for competence, you get what he calls the male variability hypothesis.
Right. Men are the experimental sex in evolutionary terms. Nature rolls the dice with men. That's why you see more men at the absolute top of the bell curve CEOs, chess grandmasters, inventors, and also way more men at the absolute bottom.
Like in prison, homelessness, suicide.
Exactly. Riker says this massive variance isn't due to patriarchy or systemic privilege. It's literally just the evolutionary filter at work. High risk, high reward.
Which leads right into his concept of the male social contract. And listener, I think this is one of the most important parts of the deep dive because it explains his theory on why so many men are just checking out today.
It's the foundational deal of society. Civilization, according to Riker, is a bargain. Historically, men agreed to suppress their immediate primal urges, their innate desire for absolute freedom and violence.
And in exchange, they took on the heavy burden of provision and protection.
Right, but they expected something very specific in return. They expected assurance of paternity and a lasting legacy.
It's the classic trade. I will break my back building this city and working these fields, but I absolutely need to know my kids are mine and my house is my castle.
That was the binding contract. But Riker argues the modern state has completely betrayed that contract. Through the weaponization of what he calls the feminine imperative, specifically things like no-fault divorce and the massive expansion of the welfare state, the government has effectively stepped in and replaced the husband and father.
He compares this exact dynamic to ancient Rome, right? The lex fermentaria.
The Roman grain dole. Yeah, this is a really chilling historical parallel he draws. In the early days of the Roman Republic, the ideal citizen was the independent farmer soldier.
The guy working his own land.
Right. He owned his land, he fought for it in the legions, he fed his own family, he was completely sovereign. But then politicians realized they could secure power by offering free grain to buy votes.
Free stuff for votes. Literally a tale as old as time.
It is, but look at the psychological shift that happened. That fierce independent farmer eventually abandoned his fields to move to the city and just live off the government dole. He went from being a proud producer to a dependent client of the state.
He traded his sovereignty for a loaf of bread.
Exactly. And Riker says we have done the exact same thing in the modern West. We heavily tax the productive men to subsidize a massive bureaucratic system that makes those very same men socially obsolete.
And when a contract is broken that badly, the other party is eventually going to walk away.
Enter the Soshoku Danshi.
The herbivore men of Japan.
Yes. These are the millions of guys who have just stopped. No dating, no marriage, no desperately climbing the corporate ladder to impress anyone.
And the mainstream media usually paints them as just losers or guys addicted to video games who can't hack it.
But Riker says no, you have to look closer at the incentives. This is a highly rational economic decision. If the legal systems are set up so that marriage is a massive liability, where a guy can lose his house, his savings, and access to his kids on a total whim, and the culture simultaneously tells him his masculinity is inherently toxic.
The math just doesn't work.
Right. The cost of entering the market vastly exceeds the potential reward.
It's basically a strike.
It is a general strike of the producers. Riker argues that when men realize the game is fundamentally rigged, the only winning move left is not to play. They retreat, they minimize their tax footprint, and they essentially let the system collapse under its own bloated weight.
Okay, so if this is the state of play, how does he say we got here? Riker clearly doesn't think this was just some historical accident. He points a finger directly at a very specific group, the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, he views them as the architects of what we now call cultural Marxism.
To give the listener some background, we're talking about the Institute for Social Research back in the 1920s, right?
1923 in Germany. These Marxist intellectuals realized that the traditional working class revolution just wasn't going to happen. The Western capitalist economy was actually doing too well, raising living standards.
So they shifted the entire battlefield.
Exactly. If they couldn't seize the factories and the means of production, they decided they would seize the culture and the institutions of knowledge.
They completely moved the fight from economics to identity.
Riker specifically highlights a guy named Herbert Marcuse and his highly influential concept of repressive tolerance. This, according to Riker, is essentially the operating system of the modern left.
Repressive tolerance. Explain how that works.
Well, Marcuse argued that to create a truly liberated society, you actually have to be aggressively intolerant of the intolerant. You have to suppress right-wing or traditional movements to protect the oppressed.
Which sounds kind of nice on paper, until you realize they're the ones who get to unilaterally define who is intolerant.
Bingo. Riker argues this exact essay is the literal blueprint for modern cancel culture and hate speech laws. It gives the institution the absolute moral license to silence anyone who defends tradition biology or the logic of kings by simply slapping a label of hater on them.
It weaponizes empathy.
It totally weaponizes empathy.
This plays right into what he calls the gynocentric inversion, swapping out the father archetype for the mother archetype.
Think about what those archetypes represent historically. The authoritarian father represents rigid law, strict boundaries, stoicism, and doing what is absolutely necessary, even if it's incredibly painful.
Building roads, bridges, fighting wars. That's classic father energy.
Right. While the nurturing mother archetype represents immediate safety inclusion and making absolutely sure no one feels bad or gets left out.
And Riker says we've essentially let the nurturing mother archetype take over the entire apparatus of the state.
We now prioritize safetyism and emotional comfort over actual competence. And Riker says this is fatal for a civilization. You end up with a society that is soft, incredibly fragile, and fundamentally unable to maintain its own hard infrastructure.
He points to Title IX on college campuses as the ultimate pure expression of this inversion.
He calls them kangaroo courts. It's a complete legal abomination in Riker's view.
Because they changed the standard of evidence.
Right. These Title IX tribunals completely removed the presumption of innocence. They use what's called the preponderance of evidence standard, which is just 51% certainty instead of the traditional beyond a reasonable doubt standard.
He calls this shift a metaphysical assault. That's a really heavy term to use for a university legal procedure.
He uses that term because he says it actually destroys the concept of the individual. In these campus courts, you aren't an autonomous citizen named John Smith with constitutional rights. You are simply reduced to a male.
And the accuser is just a female.
Exactly. Riker argues the system is explicitly rigged to automatically believe the designated victim class over the designated oppressor class, regardless of the actual empirical facts of the case.
It just completely strips a man of his agency and his right to a fair defense.
It is the state essentially saying, your objective reality does not matter at all. Only her subjective feelings matter.
Okay, so the logos is sundered, the institutions are totally captured, and the law is rigged. It paints a pretty bleak picture. But listener, this is where the weapon part of the book really comes into play.
Right, he doesn't just want you to doom scroll and give up.
No, he wants to teach you what he calls syllogistic warfare.
This is honestly my favorite part of the entire text. He essentially wants you to learn to think and argue like a medieval logician trapped in a cage fight.
It's all about mastering the categorical syllogism to instantly dismantle fallacies. Let's get really specific here, because the tactics are fascinating. He breaks down the Motte and Bailey tactic.
We see this one every single day on social media and the news, but once you actually have a name for it, you see it absolutely everywhere.
Let's just role play it real quick so the listener really gets how it works in practice. I'll be the Riker disciple and you be the activist.
Okay, let's do it. I will start with the Bailey, which is the highly radical, indefensible position. I say we need to completely abolish the police and shut down all prisons entirely because the entire justice system is inherently racist.
And I respond to that by saying that's totally insane.
Yeah.
If you abolish the police, violent crime will skyrocket immediately and innocent people are going to die in the streets.
Right, so now I'm losing the argument, so I retreat to the Mott, which is the highly defensible, emotionally safe position. I look at you and say, wow, why do you hate justice so much? All I'm saying is that we should invest more money in mental health and community support. Don't you want to help people?
See, and now I look like a complete jerk for opposing helping people. You totally shifted the ground.
Exactly. I quietly swapped out my radical argument for a very mild one to make you look like the aggressor.
And Riker says the counter tactic is you have to burn the Bailey.
Burn it to the ground. Do not ever let me retreat to that safe ground. You have to aggressively pivot back and say, no, we aren't talking about community mental health funding right now.
Yeah.
You literally just said abolish prisons. Defend that specific claim.
You just have to relentlessly pin them to their own extreme words.
And relentlessly. Another really common tactic he teaches you to defeat is the Gish Gallop. He uses a strategy called anchor and hold for this.
Right. The Gish Gallop is when an opponent just spews out like 50 different accusations in 1 minute.
Yeah, they just flood the zone. They say you're a misogynist and the gender wage gap is real. And what about historic systemic injustice? And words are literal violence.
And if you try to answer all of those at once, you lose. You just look defensive and scattered.
So you anchor and hold. You pick just one thing from their barrage, usually the weakest, most factually incorrect thing.
Give me an example.
You hold up a hand and say, stop. You just said words are violence. That is factually and biologically false. Violence requires physical kinetic force. Words are just sound waves. Let's stay right there until we resolve that.
And you just completely refuse to move on until they concede that point. You break their entire momentum.
Exactly. He also talks extensively about the art of the frame. And he uses a really interesting real-world example here, Andrew Tate.
Now, listener, put aside whatever you personally think of Tate as a guy. Riker is just analyzing a highly specific interview technique Tate used here.
Right. It's a tactic Riker calls the silence of the king. So Tate was in this hostile mainstream interview, and the host threw what Riker calls a verbal grenade.
Like a massive loaded accusation intended to make him panic and scramble.
Right, an accusation of extreme misogyny. Now, most normal people, when hit with that, would immediately start backpedaling, apologizing, or explaining themselves. They'd say, no, I love women. I have a mother. I have a sister.
Which instantly frames you as the defendant begging for mercy from the judge.
But Tate didn't do that. He just sat there. He looked directly at the host and said absolutely nothing. He just let the dead silence stretch out.
That is so painfully awkward to watch.
It is, but it forces the hostile interviewer to sit alone in the sheer stupidity of their own loaded question. Riker argues that by completely refusing to speak, Tate rejected the entire premise of the interaction.
He simply refused to step into the misogyny box they built for him.
The lesson there is you must never accept the premise of a loaded question. Silence, when used strategically, is a massive power move. It shows their authority over you is just an illusion.
All of these tactics really roll up into what Riker calls the code of conduct for the integral man. He lists out 4 key articles you have to live by. First is speak the truth. Parrhesia.
Parrhesia is a great concept. It means speaking the truth specifically when it is socially or physically dangerous to do so. Riker frames it as an act of calculated aggression against the lie.
Second article, never apologize for facts.
This is definitely the hardest one for modern men to adopt. We are deeply conditioned by the culture to be nice and accommodating.
To keep the peace.
Right. But Riker says, if you state a biological reality like noting the actual physical differences in strength between the sexes, and someone gets offended, do not ever say sorry.
An apology without fault is an abdication of sovereignty.
That's his exact phrasing. If you apologize just to smooth things over, you are willingly handing your personal power over to the most emotionally unstable person in the room.
Third article, defend the weak.
But here's the controversial twist on that classic trope. He specifically means you need to defend men.
Because the state doesn't.
Right. His argument is that the entire apparatus of the state and the culture already relentlessly defends and subsidizes women. But who defends the young hyperactive boy being heavily medicated just for acting like a boy in a modern classroom?
Or who defends the father being stripped of his assets in family court?
Exactly. Riker says a king protects his own tribe first. And for the intended reader of this field manual, that tribe is men.
And the fourth and final article is build infrastructure.
Rome was built on roads, not feelings. Riker absolutely despises the black-pilled doomers who just sit online and complain about the collapse of the West.
He wants actual competence.
He demands it. He says, learn the law, learn how to physically build a house, learn to grow your own food, learn to code and build parallel digital networks. Competence is the only real authority that matters. If you can't actually build civilization, you have zero right to complain about it collapsing.
Which perfectly brings us to his final vision for the reader, the Renaissance of Kings.
It's a call to elevate yourself to a philosopher king. Now, he doesn't necessarily mean ruling a literal nation state. He means ruling the micro-state of your own life with absolute authority.
Riker wants you to build an internal mental fortress where the logic of kings reigns supreme over everything else.
So when the outside world is screaming and protesting, when the media is actively lying to you, when the corporate HR department is threatening your livelihood,
You are completely unmoved.
you are indifferent to the shrieking of the possessed. You operate entirely on the frequency of the logos. In a world of emotional children, you become the adult in the room.
It is a massive, completely uncompromising vision. And look, listener, we have barely scratched the paint on this thing today. We talked a lot about the tactics and the mindset, but the actual historical depth in this book, the deep breakdown of the legal codes, the really specific philosophical arguments, it is incredibly dense and rewarding.
Yeah, if this conversation fired you up today, if you feel like you've been searching for the manual to finally understand why the world feels like it's going crazy, you absolutely need to go straight to the source material.
Absolutely. Stop what you are doing, go to Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now and buy Knowledge Acquisition, Continuous Strategic, Reflective Learning, and Integral Theory by Conrad Riker.
It's not just a book to read once and put on a shelf, it's the ammunition you've been looking for.
And if you want to follow the author's ongoing war against emotive drivel, you need to follow at Conrad Riker at Substack. That's at Conrad Riker on Substack.
The war for the mind isn't coming. It's already here. You really better have your weapons ready.
I couldn't agree more. And before we go, I'm going to leave you, listener, with a challenge inspired directly by Riker. We spent a lot of time today talking about the sunder of the logos, right?
Yeah, language severed from reality.
So try this. Just for the next 24 hours, try to speak only the absolute objective truth.
Oh, wow.
No social lubrication, no polite little nods to things, deep down or biologically or logically false. Just speak the logos.
Honestly, that sounds genuinely dangerous in today's climate.
The truth usually is. See what relationships and assumptions crumble around you, and then see what is actually left standing when the dust clears.
That's a great challenge.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive, everyone. Make sure you like and subscribe to support the mission. Check out the book on Amazon or Google Play, and we will see you on the other side.